So what I'm going to do is give a brief presentation today, which the aim is to raise as many questions as it answers, looking at one particular aspect of the Faith in the Nexus report. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat as we're going along, just in case you forget them, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end to discuss them. We're going to unpack one particular finding of the research. You should be able to see the second slide. That's now. Right. Yeah. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to run through then is to look at the key findings of the sense of connection, the sense of belonging to school and parish that we found within this research. And it relates to the strengths of connection within the nexus. The key finding that we want to look at is that where there was a strong perception of a strong active relationship between church and school, there was a perception of more evidence of faith-related activities happening at home. So it's that sense of belonging that we want to unpack. How did the families feel, the pupils, the parents, that they belonged to church? Now, to go back a little bit further, there's various ways, various models we can look at ways of belonging. We could start with the fact that a sense of belonging is a basic human need, and it's critical for well-being, and I would argue it's critical for spiritual well-being. However, we're aware many factors influence the sense to which somebody feels that they belong to one group or another. It can be the size of the group, it can be the extent of the person's network, it can be the number of different ties that they do have. If you look at Putnam's ideas of bonding and bridging capitals and strong and weak ties, there's quite a complex way that people feel that they belong or express a belonging. But there's an increasing awareness that in today's age, people express belonging in different ways. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone highlighted the decrease in involvement in social groups. The decrease in the number of people who express belonging to church in traditional sense of church attendance is well documented. But what I want to pick up today is this is not the only way to measure how individuals express a sense of belonging to religion and to an institutional church. Now, there are various models I could have used to look at this, and I'm just going to run through three that are very valid, but I haven't used them today. There's one of the ones that I've used before is Danielle Hervé-Leger's work on belonging through the different dimensions of religion, through cultural, communal, ethical, and emotional. Now, this is quite interesting. She's a French sociologist and used it in the context of Catholicism. You can think of the cultural Catholic, the cultural Christian. As I remember when I was teaching, one girl explained to me, of course she was a Catholic because she had fish on Friday. So that's one way of belonging. You've got your communal belonging, perhaps your more traditional understanding of involvement in church activities, in church services or church-like activities. One of the ways which will be interesting to look at the data, which I haven't got time to do today, is the ethical way of belonging. Well, in the interviews with the parents and in the surveys with the parents, one of the ways they did strongly connect, was the values of Christianity. That's what they were looking for in their church schools. That's what they wanted to bring into their homes, that ethical sense of religion. The emotional is an interesting one to look at. It's sort of, I've looked at it before through the Lord's pilgrimage with sixth formers. It's that mountain high experience that they get when they're on pilgrimage or something like that. And it's that attachment that they're attached to the religion in a different way. The other two examples I've got there, which I haven't really got time to go into today, but which are really interesting to look at, is the Bible Society's Lumino research, where they've looked at the ways people attach or engage with the Bible and the different personas that they could identify in the way people engaged with the Bible. And the third one was 2018, I think this was quite an interesting typology of Catholics. How do young Catholics engage with Catholicism today? So there's different models, there's different ways of looking. The one I've chosen to look at today is David Walker's model. Now, David Walker is now Anglican Bishop of Manchester, developed a model of the variety of ways people belong to God through church. He's written it up in an accessible book published in 2017. But he developed this model previously, and he wrote about it a lot in 2011. And it was developed after a study of people attending Worcester Cathedral Carol Service, and I think also Lichfield Carol Service, and harvest festivals in rural churches. And he identified 4 different ways people expressed a sense of belonging. Through church activities. Now, this is the one that traditionally you think of the way people belong. It's the things that take place on a regular basis, which could be your Sunday service, or it might be your Bible study in the middle of the week, or anything like that, an activity that requires regular commitment. The second one, and this is the one I might pick up quite a bit today, is events. That connection, a sense of belonging through events, through engagement at certain times of the church's year, the major Christian festivals, or at key times of life, baptism, marriage, funerals, First Holy Communion. At there's certain points, it's like the pattern of the church's year and the rhythm of life. People engage at key moments. The third way he identified is through people, through relationship. And it often might be the way that people connect through the local vicar, but it could be somebody else involved in the church and they have a sense of belonging through that person who belongs to church. It's almost like a vicarious sense of belonging. And the fourth, which I think is a really interesting one for church schools, is the sense of place, that they belong to that church building or have a sense of belonging to the churchyard because that's where their family is buried. Now, these are not set out on a continuum. It's not that one is stronger or weaker than another. It echoes to some extent the work of Nancy Ammerman in the United States. Sense of belonging is different in kind, but not in strength. It's also not either or. It's not you only belong through one way. In fact, many people who are heavily involved in Christian church might belong through all 4 ways. But for many of the people we're talking about today, it's several of these ways sort of overlapping in different ways. And I think I've found this model really useful to understand how our church school families in the Nexus study expressed a sense of belonging to the Christian faith. For example, the belonging through events. Now, this is a critical way that many of these parents expressed a sense of belonging, and it's one that's often overlooked or underestimated. A recent paper by Professor Leslie Francis and colleagues, it's just come out this year, 2021, highlighted the impact of a sense of belonging through the Christmas Eve carol services at Liverpool Cathedral. And they highlighted the impact on spiritual well-being. Leslie says, when given the opportunity to reflect seriously on their experience of attending the service, well over half of the attendees felt they were going away feeling better about themselves, feeling better about other people, feeling better about the world, and feeling better about God. It's that sense, it's a sense of belonging for people who may only turn up to the Christmas carol service at Liverpool Cathedral, but actually it is important to them. So the key message before we look at the findings that I want to stress is paying attention to the different ways of belonging is critical. Sense of belonging is a basic human need. It's important for individual spiritual well-being, and critically, we need to start where people are, not where we want them to be. And I think that's when we look at the church school families that I'm talking about, that's really important. The next slide, I'm going to skip over quite briefly. Not that briefly there. I'm going to skip over quite briefly because we've talked about this before, and any information about them is found in the Nexus Report, which is available on the NICER website. Now, we were a empirical mixed methods research project undertaken by NICER, and the key question that all this revolves around is how do church primary schools in England collaborate with the local church, the parachurch organisations, and facilitate opportunities to explore faith and spiritual life in the home. Now, we did focus group interviews with about 450 participants. We had about 1,000 participants in the online survey. This all took place pre-COVID, so it's June 2018 to 2019. And we analysed the interviews looking for evidence of the connection and took upon that, from that, the qualitative data informs the quantitative online survey, and then the online survey again informs the qualitative data. It was quite a circular process. And I think it's really interesting, the data we've got. We've got a rich source of data which we still haven't fully finished analysing. But before we go further, we just need to think a little bit about the families that we've got. in the survey, we put an open text question. I didn't ask people in interviews, but in the survey, we asked them and say, well, how would you describe your religious affiliation? Or we put, how would you describe your family's faith? 363 of the participants answered this question. 79%, that's nearly 80%, described themselves as Christian. A quarter of those qualified this with reference to attending church. 7% described themselves as being Muslim, Hindu, or Sikh. 2.5% mixed faith background, and 10% described themselves as being non-religious. We gave them this open text, and then they could put, well, what did they mean? So we had various responses. We had, we are passionate Christians. We're Christians, we pray twice a day. I like praying to God because it makes me feel happy. For others, they put, we're Christians and go to church. Or one was quite thoughtful, we attend a Christian church reasonably frequently, approximately once every 6 weeks. And it was that idea that people were thinking, because we haven't asked them specifically, tell us if you go to church or not, but a lot of them needed to add it. And the majority who added it to qualify that they did not do so. We have beliefs, but we don't go to church. We believe in God, but we don't attend church. We have beliefs in the children of Christians, but we do not attend church. So there was this balance of somehow feeling that actually, and this is, I want to explore this in another paper elsewhere, what does it mean to think that you're a Christian but you're not in church? And the sense of, as one of the pupils said, we're not proper Christians, are we? And I think that needs unpacking a lot more. But you can see from that there's quite varied responses from the families. So let's, I realise, time's moving on. So just to move on then to what are we talking about with a sense of connection? One of the key questions in the survey were to try and find out how attached to the school and to the church were the children and their parents as well. And then to look at the variability in children's attachment to their school and their church. So pupils were asked, how strong do you think the connection is between school and church? And then they could slide a bar from 0 to 100. How connected do you feel to school? And how connected do you feel to the local church? Now, if you look at the graph we've got there, if you look at the blue bars, you can see connection to school is fairly consistent. Where the interesting analysis comes in is in the orange bars. The sense of connection to school, to church, varied between the schools. We've got the schools at the top half, or at this end, where really strong connection to church. Those at the bottom are much less of a connection. So then it was to go back into the data, go back into the qualitative data and say, well, what's happening here? And it was not as easy to say, well, obviously they've got a very strong minister or strong church there. They haven't. That wasn't quite as well, because what came through was perception. A lot of it was where a strong active relationship up here was perceived, then there was more evidence in the rest of the survey of faith-related activities happening at home. We know that flourishing connections between school, home and church nurtures relationships between individuals and institutions. And we also know the powerful impact that these positive relationships have on aspects of family life. It's mostly unseen, but it became really significant that the church school families put on their connection, in the significance the church school families put on their connection with the local church. Now, the key thing here is perception. It's important to note that it was the importance of a perception of a strong relationship by church school families, pupils and parents. Because some of these schools where participants reported a strong connection in the survey, or where they spoke really positive of a relationship in the interviews, were, according to the school leaders, schools where they did not have a strong active relationship with the local church or the local clergy. The head teachers or the school leaders would explain to me, well, there's no physical local church nearby, or that the minister was not involved in the school through deliberate choice or because of time constraints. However, and this, I haven't got time to go into this today, but in the report, how the school leaders, those school leaders, worked around this by engaging with other denominations, or in one case, the local convent, is, I think, really critical here. And I could point to some of the schools in that top end where you think, well, actually, there's no connection with the Anglican Church in the traditional sense, but the school leaders, the head teachers, have found a way around that. And for parents and pupils, there is a perception that there is a strong relationship with the church, because many of the parents and pupils were not aware if it was a pastor or a Methodist minister in school. To them, it was still a minister, a connection, a person with connected with church. Right, to move on then, to look at, how were people connected? I'm going to start with events, because that was the one that came through most clearly when you were talking to parents and children. How are you connected to the church? And there were two key areas: the pattern of the church's year and rites of passage. The pattern of the church's year came through really strongly. A lot of parents were, they love the sense of the rhythm of the Christian life, the nativities, the Easter services. And all schools are structured on routines. They all have a rhythm of a year marked out by term dates. And a church school adds on, or adds in, embeds this pattern of the church's year, with the key markers being the Christian festivals. Now, the church schools in this case has deliberately emphasised the rhythm of the church's year in the school. The minister in school explained why she believed it was so important to embed this rhythm in the school, and she was tracking the effect that this had on the pupils. There were three main times of year which parents mentioned: harvest, Advent, Christmas, Lent and Easter. Other times mentioned less frequently were Remembrance Day, and obviously the school services of welcome and leavers services. Noticeable by its absence was mentioned of Pentecost. Again, I haven't got time to go into that now, and I've explored a little bit in the report the reasons why, why is that not a main festival? But these Christian festivals are key points when the families connect with the Christian faith. There were times which children and parents were most likely to do something at home connected with faith. But I just want to pick up 2 points which I didn't really get a chance to explore in the report. For the school, one parent said the school go over at church at Easter and at Christmas. It's involving parents as well. It's like we're allowed to come into the church to share that with the church and the children. And another parent in a different school said, for me, for our faith, important service like Easter, we always go on Christmas Day, which is nice, and we've come to midnight mass. And 2 things struck me about these. There are many, many more quotes that I could have chosen to make this point. Was the church school is a gatekeeper. That sense that the school allows parents to go into church came across it again and again. They would go through church, through a church school event, but not otherwise. And this idea that parents which say these services are important for our faith. A different view was expressed by one minister, and this is where the gap arises. He was very active in the church school, very supportive of the church school, and he says, parents from here will put me down as their faith reference for church secondary school, and they will put down that they come to church. The only times that they come to church are with the school. So we don't give them a faith reference, because that's not what faith references are about. Now, I think that highlights the gap of perception we have here between individuals, the parents, who interpret their attendance at key festivals through school as belonging to church, and that of many church school and mission policies who necessarily interpret belonging in terms of regular Sunday church attendance. I think that's one question that we need to explore a little bit further. Alongside the pattern of the church's year is the rhythm of life. Those key moments when individuals do engage with the church: baptism, First Holy Communion, marriage and funerals. And clergy in the research often said they'd have lots of requests from school families for baptisms, marriages, funerals at the church linked to the primary school. I had a number of clergy telling me about people coming back to get married at their primary school church because that was the only church they'd known. One of the ministers I spoke to identified that there was an issue here if there was a lack of engagement at these times with these individuals or families. When they've done all the requirements, they just move away and you don't see them till the next one. They get married or they have children of their own to baptise, and then they come back to the school. You have to kind of accompany them, their journey and the faith, otherwise it's meaningless. So it's that sense of how we're engaging. When people do connect, how does the church connect with them? One of the ways of connection is relationships, the idea of bridging people. What came clearly through the research was a positive relationship with a local minister was seen as key as this visible connection between church and school. The one consequence is that the minister is able to develop a strong relationship with the church school families. There's both pastoral and spiritual relationship. One minister said, "I just come and spend time on the playground at the end of school." You pick up a few things that people are either say because they know they see you, or they might be nervous about ringing you about. He went on to say that school is such a large constituent of the parish. You can get to be present, if not to actually meet a large constituent in one go. Now, this approach was controversial. In other schools, some questioned whether church school families were part of the parish community. A local Methodist minister to one school, who was heavily involved in the primary school because the Anglican vicar was not, commented on the vicar and said, he complains, "Why should I invest in the school? No school family goes to church. I think he just has his services at the wrong times. Farmers are really busy. I do a service at 3 p.m. That's better time for the farmers. The families, they do go to church with school." Speaking to other ministers, it was aware that it was a problematic area because they said their congregations were resentful of time spent in school as they did not see evidence of parents, children, or staff in church on Sunday. But as possible an area for questionings, for discussions here, is like, who are the other bridging people? Who are the other people who could have that critical role of connecting school and church? And I've highlighted their foundation governors. I've not explored that very in much depth yet, but I think that's an area that possibly could be an interesting area to look at their role as being a visible connection between school and church. Moving on. Church activities. Now, this is the traditional one of regular attendance at Sunday services. And they worked for some of the families in the report. It was the way they expressed the belonging. They had a regular attendance at church. They told me about involvement in Bible study or justice and peace groups. But there was also the perception that some of the families came to church because it was to obtain places for their children in school. As one minister said, they only go to church in order to get the place in school, and then they kind of disappear. It happens, and it happens very often. A foundation governor in another school put a more positive interpretation on these families not coming to church. A huge number of them would say they're committed Catholics, but not necessarily have the time to come to church. A lot of them actually work all the hours God sends, especially in our parish. The parents tend to work exceptionally hard, which doesn't leave much space. Another area that there was an involvement in church or church-like activities, which is a more fuzzy connection to church. A member of an Open the Book team in one of the schools highlighted the key ways that parents saw themselves as connected to church. Now, when you talk to parents and say, "Do you go to church?" they will say, "If I open the book," and things like messy church is church. Now, participation in church-like, not like, but like activities, messy church, open the book worships, was for some participation in church worship. Messy church is an Anglican activity, for those who don't know, held in a church or school building, usually involves a craft activity and an element of worship. Many of the parents and pupils who went to messy church interpreted that as attending church, and there was a sense of belonging to the wider church community. This research obviously did not explore the extent to which the Sunday congregation saw attendance at these activities as belonging to the church, but some of the clergy viewed these activities as quite separate, more as a youth activity than a church activity. Others offered a wider sense of church community and included the families who attended, for example, messy church. And that's another area that I think needs much greater exploration. Moving on, so we've got time for discussion. The place, our church. That the church connected to the primary school was often referred to as our church. And as one member of staff from one of the schools said, within the school, those who don't necessarily go to the church, by that they meant go to the church on Sunday, would see the church next to the school as their church. Several of the clergy noted the allegiance church school families had to the church building. There was a sense that this was the only church building known to them, and from their experience in primary school was the one with which they were most familiar. This obviously raised an issue when there wasn't a church near the school. In a few cases, the church was miles away, as one says, it's miles away from the estate it serves, or one church had been closed down in one of the Catholic schools, an area of severe multiple deprivation in the local church had been closed. And the staff there said how bereft they were without a church where they could, for example, display First Communion photos. They had an imaginative way of getting around it and used the local convent, the chapel in the local convent, of which the sisters were really happy to be involved. But it's that sense of how do you have that connection with a building if there is no building there? Now, there's much more I could say about that. There's a lot of, but this has been quite a brief look at the 4 ways in which families express a connection to church. And I think using David Walker's model has given us a sense of all the different ways, and I'm sure there's more, of how people express their belonging to church and how that sense of belonging matters to them. So what have we, the Nexus research has revealed then that there's different ways people belong to church, and the value individuals placed on this connection. The idea that this is different in kind, not in strength of belonging, and that, I think that needs unpacking a little bit more and thinking about what do we mean, and are we being judgmental if we say, well, if they only go at Christmas, that's not as strong, that is not as good as. And the key thing, it comes back to the whole point of a lot of this research, underpinning a lot of it, is recognising where people are and acknowledging perhaps for many that is where they want to stay. It's not like a progression. Well, if you join this bit and can connect this bit, then you'll want to connect or belong that way. For many, they'd be quite happy staying where they are and being there all the time. Right, I'm just going to put up the last slide, which is some questions that I've thought of, but I'm sure you've probably got many more questions to think about and to maybe help us shape, this question that actually, am I right in calling them occasional belongers? Is that the correct terminology? When are the key moments? Where are those key moments? And how do we make the most of them? How do we recognise those moments? And it's the opportunity to engage and include and be inclusive of these people who are at the edges, who see themselves at the edges of church communion. What I haven't got into here is a number of pupils and parents, well, we're not proper Christians. That idea that, well, actually, we're sort of Christians, but there's our proper Christians out there. And how do you reach out without being intrusive? Because those people don't want to maybe move in a particular direction. They're not believing without belonging because they haven't got strong beliefs and they're not belonging without believing. It's just that mixed, it's that fuzzy bit in the middle, I think, that, they have sort of beliefs and they have some beliefs and they have bits of Christianity, often a primary school understanding of Christianity from their primary schools of, believing. And it's that sense of belonging, though, that sense of, we do belong in a different way. And what I haven't explored today, but which, is really interesting, that sort of sense of, well, we're not really Christians, we're not proper. And that was, I think, what people were telling me when they put on that open text response, just like, tell me about how you belong to your faith or something. And they just put, I'm Christian but don't go to church, or a lot, I'm Catholic and don't go to church, as if that's one thing, as if, they needed to tell me that for some reason. And I think that's, it's really interesting to unpack that. Yeah, and I think some of these people, they were, in their minds, committed to Christianity, but it didn't involve doing very much. And I think that is part of the unpacking commitment, like previously, commitment. And what I've got when I've spoken to congregations, I was on a parish retreat in Assisi with a load of elderly Catholic ladies, and I was talking about what I was doing, and they were like, yeah, but we got up and went to mass every Sunday. We had to get our children. They're not committed. And it's that sense of commitment means you do things and you regularly do them. And I think it has changed. And it's a sense of, What does it mean to say, you belong, and you belong through primary school? And the other big thing we haven't talked about here is primary school ends when children are 11. And when your last child's gone through primary school, what connection do you then have? What sense of belonging is there for you? And yes, you might return to that primary school church for your marriage and for your funeral. But there is that sense of where do you go from that connection? And you talk to parents, you talk to church schools. It's a very active pattern of the church's year that you get in a church primary school. You have your regular services in church, but it's where that goes after the end of primary school. I think is really important. I think it was to some extent that they were seeking something. It's overall, it's sort of anecdote. I just remember these parents. I hear these parents' voices. That one of them was telling me how she'd got really involved in the food bank, and that was from going to the church school harvest festival. That they'd had the harvest festival in the church, and the vicar had done his usual sort of harvest festival importance of that, and it had really struck her, and she'd gone on to get involved in the food bank. The number who were asking themselves these questions, and I think this is what we often forget, that often when you've got a church school service in church, the parents are listening, the parents are finding answers to their questions or seeking answers to their questions, and often that's forgotten, that the parents aren't there as spectators of watching what their children are doing. They could tell me, they would remember, the sermons, the homilies that the vicar, the priest had said, or that assembly. You remember when there was that assembly on this? Not that their child had told them, but they'd been there. And I think that's really important, that they are reaching out, but it's where are the bridges? How do they? It's not made easy. And that the number of parents who said, "Oh, we're allowed to go with the school," as if they don't know how else you would get into church. You'd have to be something different, but you can go with school because that's open to anybody. Yes, and I think often that's the thing, that from one of the ministers I spoke, it was like, well, they don't come back. They come for First Holy Communion or they come for their baptisms, and then I never see them again. But then if you hear it from the other side, the parents will say, well, we went, and then there was nothing afterwards. And it's like, where are those bits? Where are those next steps being put in place? Thinking, well, if you're saying that they've not engaged, that they've not actively made the effort, I think it goes both ways. And I think that's really, important to sort of be aware of that. And that's why I put the question, be aware of those key moments. And what are we doing? Are we just saying, well, that's it, you've got that, you've had that? Or are you saying, well, maybe, and not all of them, a few of them might think, well, actually, that's quite good, I'd like to do that a bit more, or I'd come to, and it's, I think it's really difficult. I think what was very clear, you talking about Bourdieu's and the habitats and things like that, they're happy, they're content, and they fit in with that of the church school. It's interesting because I'm just trying to write another article about how a church school interprets institutional Christianity. Because church school Christianity is quite different to the Christianity that you get in a church, and parents are happy with that habitus, that sense of tradition, that sense of Christianity that you have in a church school. They don't know, a lot of them, what it is like in the church. There was a lot of misperceptions on both sides, and a lot of the parents thought, well, people who go to church, they've got it sorted. They're the ones, they don't have doubts. And it's the not knowing. And a lot of staff, a lot of head teachers was taught, it's like, when we go to church for a proper church service, I sit at the front so the parents know when to stand, when to sit, or we tell them, the pupils know what to do, follow your children. And it's simple things like that. It's like that, not knowing where you finish the Lord's Prayer in a Catholic and an Anglican school. And it's just, it is that sense of feeling, where do you feel at home? In one of the schools, not in this research, another research, church primary schools are really pushed for space. But the church was next door, and I said, well, I'll do my interviews in the church. They've got the room in the church. And they were like, no, the parents won't cross the threshold. They won't go in the church. If we have them in the school, they'll come in and they'll be quite happy to talk to you. If we say you're in the church, they're not going. And it is, I know that's space and something different, but it is that sense, it's different. And I think that Christian ethos in a church school, it's like, you can engage with that, you can understand that, you can be part of that, but that's not the same as what it is in a church.